It was May 2022. I had just released Heinrich's Call of Cthulhu Guide to Character Creation. Out of the blue, I get contacted by someone offering to redo the layout of the entire book. At first I thought it was a scam, but it was no scam. It was just Alex being awesome. Greetings, Miskatonic Repository. My name is Heinrich Mohr, and I once thought creating scenarios required an author to write it, an editor to edit it, and maybe an artist to create an eye-catching cover. Now, I understand that layout design is an equally necessary fourth component. Another thing I get to thank Alex for. You likely know him as the ENNIE-Award winning author of scenarios like Los Hobos and the Wolves of Carcosa, the Grindhouse series, Viral, and its sequel, Vermis. But Alex's contributions go much further, and it is correct to say that the Miskatonic Repository would not be what it is, and look as good as it does, without his work as a layout design artist. I had the good fortune to sit down with Alex for over 2 hours and ask him all my questions about himself, his work, and layout design in general. Alas, our talk was not free of technical difficulties. My mic kept squeaking, a likely result of Bluetooth interference, and I'd formatted Zoom to record in speaker view rather than gallery, messing up the resolution. That's all my fault, but hopefully you'll see the worst of those problems have been edited out. Without further ado then, let's get to the first part of my interview with author and layout artist Alex Guillotte.
Well, thank you. You're very kind. Um, no, I'm an artist who has I've been doing this sort of thing, well, art in general for forever. Pretty much right out of high school. I went to printing and then worked my way up through into more graphic design and then finally advertising, which I ended up getting out of at one point because it was a horrible business to work in with with clients
I can
who
only
were,
imagine.
yeah, it's hard to do art for money, I found, because especially when someone else is deciding what you do, and so it becomes very difficult for me to do that. So yeah, so I ended up going freelance and then doing some other things. But as far as gaming is concerned, I've been doing that for even longer. I started in the late 70s, early 80s to, with D&D like so many people did, and worked my way up through that, touched on Call of Cthulhu and did something with that. And overall just began my gaming career, you know, up through today.
But how
Um,
did you get into horror specifically?
it's honestly, it's always been that way. One of my earliest memories, when I was about 5 years old, 4 or 5 years old, my grandmother came to live with us. She wasn't doing well, so we were sort of taking care of her with my mother's mother. And I have memories of going into her bedroom early in the morning, way too early for a kid to bother an adult, with my monster magazines. I had like Monsters of Hollywood, Monsters. No, what were they called? I don't remember. But I used to get all the horror comics, you know, um, the ones that sort of like Creep Show and those things are sort of based off of, and so I've always been into that. Um, I used to get this magazine called Man, Myth, and Magic, which was definitely a more adult magazine, but it delved into all that sort of occult, supernatural sort of aspect of the world. And I mean, even as like I said in grammar school, me and a friend of mine built a cemetery in my backyard, and it was nowhere near Halloween. We just wanted a cemetery in the backyard. Yeah, so I've always been into horror since I can remember. I don't know where it
and,
came from, but that's where it happened.
and so has writing horror and doing layout design work always sort of gone hand in hand for you, or did one come before the other?
The stuff I was doing for myself always sort of leaned toward the weird and horror. That's for sure. Um, but I really only got into doing it more professionally in the age of drive-through RPG, really. I did some early D&D adventures. Um, this was way pre internet days, but it was you know, I would design something, put it on paper, take it to the library and pay 10 cents a page to or 10 cents a page to photocopy it, and then
Mhm.
staple them together, fold them, and then sell them at the local gaming shop for
Oh, wow.
like a quarter or something like that. I forget what it was, but so so I really wish I had saved one of them just because now it's sort of it would be an artifact at this point, but they maybe they're still floating around out there somewhere. But yeah, so it's I've been wanting to do things like this for a long time, and I even submitted, I think, to TSR at the time, a
Mhm.
proposal for an adventure, which didn't get picked up, obviously. But I was always interested in doing this sort of thing, and so when Drive Through RPG came along, it was sort of like, oh, this is great. Now I can actually make things that I can do, and of course I had the whole background of advertising and graphic design behind me to help, you know, to do it effectively. And so I started with a lot of D&D stuff. Which was allowed at the time because I didn't think uh, Call of Cthulhu was even on the table because this was I think I started before Miskatonic Repository was came along, and then uh, I mentioned some offhand comments. Someone's like, "Oh, I really wish I could do something for Call of Cthulhu because I really love that setting." And like, "Oh, you can now." It's like, "What? Where did this come from?"
Wow.
So it's like, originally I was going to convert one of my one of the books I had made for D&D, which was the cinematic environs books, which is basically about
Yeah.
taking an environment, making it a character, uh, utilizing it more effectively to create mood and scenes in D&D. And I thought, oh, well, this actually translates really well to Call of Cthulhu. So what I'll do is I'll just, I have all this material already, so I'll just sort of, redo the all the the rule sets and fix that up and different examples. And I thought, you know what, I wrote this Call of Cthulhu scenario for myself a while back. Maybe I'll put it at the end as just kind of like a cool bonus thing, right? So then I started to write that, and it got bigger and bigger until the scenario far outweighed the size of the material for the Environ book. So it's like, well, I guess I'm flipping this around, and that was what the pipeline became.
When I was listening to actual plays, that was one of the first scenarios that I listened to. And of course, I didn't know who you were at the time. It was only much later that I connected the dots. I was like, wait a second, he also wrote Pipeline? Holy shit.
Yeah, so, and like I said, that was almost an accident in that, like I said, my intention was just to have it as sort of like a little bonus thing at the end, just to allow people to play in a harsh environment and use the rules and be kind of fun. But it just became it quickly overwhelmed the size of the other, and it's like, well, I guess I'm doing it the other way around now.
Well, other than your own creations, what was the first layout work that you did on the Miskatonic Repository?
It might have actually been yours, as far as like
Really?
yeah, as far as doing it for someone else. I think up to that point I was doing my own things, and then I really liked your character creation book, and I loved the concept behind it. I love being able to organically sort of grow a character. It did all the really cool things that I wanted to do, and it bothered me a little bit that the layout didn't reflect the genius of the of the content, and but with a bit of polish, it makes it, it just makes it so
Absolutely.
much better.
Absolutely. More, no,
Because
more readable, more eye-catching. I mean, just across the
yeah,
board.
because like it or not, people do judge books by their cover, and people do judge content by its layout. They're much more likely to, and that's what bothered me sort of about the whole, Miskatonic Repository in general. Not, I don't want to say bother me like someone did it to me, but just I thought it was sad that people weren't being able to get out there what they really wanted to see on the page. They were limited by what they could do, and so
Mhm.
that's after you know um, doing yours, it sort of inspired me to want to do more for just regular people. Say, hey, you know what? Let's give you a really good discount on this if we can just put together something that and wasn't a lot of complex things either. A lot of it is just simple design choices that just make a huge difference. It's kind of like the example I've used before is like if you walk into a room and the front hall and the shoes are all askew and everywhere, and it gives you the impression that the whole place is a mess. But all you do is straighten out those shoes, and it feels like it's clean. It's just that little bit of order that makes
Yeah.
everything else sort of feel organized and easy to use.
Well, I really want to dive into some of those specifics, but before we do, I am assuming a lot of knowledge, um, and I may not have a lot of knowledge. So, can you kind of tell us what, from your standpoint, like what does layout design mean when people are talking about this? What is it that you understand?
Well, layout ideally you want to be user friendly, right? It's very much like software in that way. In that when someone goes into it, you can find things easily. And a lot of that goes down to the basics of how humans look at text. Like if you can have the same number of letters in a on a page, but if it's all like just a wall of text with no breaks in it, it's going to be overwhelming to the person trying to read it. Versus you start putting it in paragraphs, that's better. If you need to call something out, you put it in a little block, that's better. If you need to bullet point stuff, that's better. You know what I mean? So you can by these little bits of organization, you get suddenly this overwhelming wall of text that is incomprehensible to you into something that's like,
Mhm.
oh, okay, now I can do this because we're really good at handling small things, but we easily get overwhelmed just by sheer mass of of trying to plow through that level of text. And that carries over to things like to make sure that everything sort of aligns up, that you want the picture boxes to line up with the text. All that sort of gives the impression of organization. Even if it doesn't really affect it, it still helps your mind to sort of feel like it's more organized and more it gets your mind in that organized state, I guess. And when I say organized, I don't even necessarily mean, neat and square, although that's for complex scenarios, that's often necessary. But even something like at the other end of the spectrum, you might look at, say, a morkborg, right?
Mhm.
Where it feels like really chaotic, but the way it's put together and it's simple enough where they can get away with it, that you get this overall impression of the setting. The layout sort of speaks to the setting itself. And ideally you want the layout to suggest your scenario as well. Like you want a modern look for a modern scenario. If you're doing something in the classic era, the 1920s and 30s, then you want it to sort of reflect that. Maybe put in a little bit of, Art Deco style, maybe, or you sort of build in to your design what what the time period is. If it's older, you make it, you might have something that looks like, torn parchment at the edges, and I'm doing a sci-fi one right now that um, has, rounded boxes, and it has a very different look to it. And all of that sort of gets you in the mood as you're looking at it to be in that setting. And so the setting can also suggest, the mood and the tone and of what you're going for in your scenario.
So when you approach a project, then let's say a scenario, do you always read the scenario?
Well, usually I like to talk to the person that wrote the scenario, just so I can get a good feel for what they expect out of it. What they want to convey, because that's going
Mhm.
to be the most important thing, especially with cover, because the cover is, again, that's people's first impression of it. Um, but I don't always read them through. Like what I'll often do is read little blocks of it that are necessary. So, for example, if I'm doing a layout and I need to break up some text with a picture or a graphic, or even from one page to another, I might have to read a little bit to know, is it gonna ruin something if I separate these, or if does this make sense to be here? The other time I do it is if I'm doing more artwork in it, because
Mhm.
obviously if I need some artwork to fill in a a gap, then I start looking around at the text surrounding it, saying, okay, well, what's this section talking about? What would be
Mhm.
appropriate to fit in here? Um, and that can range from something kind of more generic and neutral, depending, if if it's sort of ambiguous, or if they have a very specific location, then I might try to see if I can come up with something that would fit that better. Now, with my own stuff, I have the advantage of, and this is one of the dark secrets of what I do sometimes. Like I'll write something, and then I'll start creating an image to represent that, whether it's a creature, whether it's a place, or whatever. And I can't get the image to come out how I described it. So I'll get a great image for how I want it, and then I'll just change my text to fit
Mhm.
it because I can.
In terms of, though, like the specific steps of layout design, what are for you the steps that you go through when you design a layout?
Well, if I'm designing first out, what I'll do is, after I've talked to the person to find out what they want. But generally speaking, I'll lay out the text first, and then see what kind of space I have available. Because what you want to do is, you don't want to do things like, you don't want to start a chapter like at the bottom of the last column on the second page. Ideally you want it to start on its own page. So you end up with things like that. But then you end up with these blocks of empty space. And so so I'll play around with that and see um, what kind of space I'm dealing with, what things can I reasonably do the artwork for versus things that are just outside of my scope, perhaps. So I base some of that on what I know I can do that would be to their satisfaction. Like I'm not great with people. I'm not a great person, character drawer, illustrator. Um, you want to turn them into a monster, I can work with you. But if it's just a person, fortunately, there's a lot of good stock material out there. That's where a lot of my artwork is photo bashing, which basically involves finding bits and pieces, putting them together, and then eventually kind of using digital painting and putting them all into this into a new form. And the one that I use, which is pretty effective, is Evanto, I think it's called. But it's a site that has just you pay a subscription fee and you get like access to their library of stock photography and so forth. And there's a lot of great material there. So even some great 3D stuff. Like in a recent one I did, um, I needed to have you know a very unique sort of device, like an iPhone, but different. And so I go through their 3D models, and you can kind of turn them around and put them in any position you want, and 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 they're not terribly expensive, if you're using it a lot.
Is there anything about this one that draws you compared to, let's say, folks who use Adobe or folks who use
So this one has a
beautiful?
lot of great things like Photoshop brushes, for example. You can buy brush sets.
Ah.
Um, they have what are called actions in Photoshop, which are basically processes that are sort of automated. So if you want to give something a certain look,
Mm.
like a sepia tone, for example, but with certain tones or whatever, you can. There are people who've created these actions that you can load in, and it will just you can tweak them, but then it will sort of just do it sort of automatically for you if you want to get this consistent look, which is kind of what you want in a scenario. You want you know it can be jarring if you've got like some a really nice piece of art, and then here you have something drawn on the back of a napkin with a crayon. It's like
Yeah.
uh those seem a little inconsistent with each other. Yeah, no, I mean that's just the one I use because it has more than one tool. It also has some video clips and some sound clips that I've used for making the little trailers I sometimes like to make for my scenarios when I release them. So things like that. It's got a lot of good sources, but there's a lot of free stuff out there too. There's a lot of good public domain um, stock, just photography out there. And especially if you're doing something older like the 1920s and 30s, there's
Mhm.
there's quite a bit out there that you can find with a little bit of looking.
how long does this take you? I mean, obviously, I think there's a lot of variation, right, depending
Yeah.
on how much art you're needing to create. But assuming sort of your baseline level of art, most of it stock art that you can find, I think, as you said, fairly
Yeah.
straightforwardly.
Yeah, it can really vary, particularly if someone has a lot of it depends on how I get the the text. Like if someone has used a lot of charts where they have little boxes with all the different text in them and stuff like that, those are the worst to deal with. From taking it from there and then putting it into InDesign, which is where I primarily do my work, because it doesn't travel well, and so I kind of have to rebuild each one, and if I've got a you know a scenario that has a lot of those, that can really slow me up. If I'm just putting in text with, section headers and subsections and then some bullet points, that's usually pretty easy. I can do something like that potentially within, like, let's say a 30 to 35 page scenario in just a couple of days, um,
Mhm.
to get sort of the general layout in place. Covers I can be pretty fast at, and of course, again, a lot of it boils down to how specific the client is. You know, I generally tell people though, if I'm doing the, you know, the this is a special deal for Miskatonic Repository, creators only. Um, that we're kind of limited on what we can do. I mean, I'll happily try and flex quite a bit, but and unfortunately, it hasn't really happened yet. But I've had clients before where that they get so very specific about what they want and then decide that what I gave them, which is what they asked for, isn't what they want, and it can really devolve very quickly. Fortunately, most
Yeah.
everyone I've worked with so far has been really really kind and has liked what I've done, and so it's been pretty easy from that perspective.
Well, given the variability then of how long these things can take, how do you figure out pricing if you're comfortable talking about that?
I mean, most of the time I try to estimate based on the number of pages because that's really the only thing that I can know for sure.
Mhm.
I will sometimes ask though if it does have a lot of charts. If it's got a lot of charts, I know that's going to be a hard hit to do. And but generally, I try to keep it under, for most scenarios, like under $200, which
Mhm.
includes the cover, the layout, um, and a few images here and there for the to fill up
Mhm.
space. Yeah, and of that, usually the cover is the most expensive bit because that's obviously takes the most effort and time and all that other stuff. Well, I shouldn't say it doesn't take more time, but it definitely takes uh, more creative effort to do,
Mhm.
you know, and but it's also the most fun for me. It's really the first thing I do when I decide I'm going to make a scenario. If I come up with an idea for a scenario, and most of the time, the first thing I do will be to create a cover for it because I'm silly that way. Definitely not the way you should be doing it. And
Hey, whatever works,
yeah,
whatever works,
exactly.
and
Yeah,
your
yeah.
results speak for themselves.
And I have the same issue with writing as well because I have found that if I just try and you know, write all out first, I have a much harder time than if I write a little bit, do some artwork for it, write a little bit, do some artwork for it, write a little bit, make a map. It's that going back and forth between the two that really is the sweet spot for me when I'm making something. Yeah, because the artwork inspires what I'm writing as well. Well, like I mentioned earlier, the idea that um, I sometimes make the writing fit the art, and that's part of it certainly.
Mm.
What can I with my limitations reasonably, what illustration can I reasonably make for this? And I see what I can put together based on what I envision, and I get something that's like, okay, now I can write about this setting based on this.
Mm.
Um, uh, Sometimes maps or deck plans or floor plans will come out sooner because I might need those in order to
Yeah.
write. Like I don't know how people write about especially if you have a scenario that takes place in a particular setting. Like how do you write about that without a map? Like I don't, I can't. I have a hard time doing that. I need to visualize. I guess maybe because I'm a very visual person, and maybe that's why I do that because it could also be that I just get bored easily with one or the other and keep going back and forth. But I think it has more to do with the fact that I need to visualize what I'm doing. And if I don't have that visual representation, you know, it's not as easy to come up with the words to describe it or to decide. Well, let's see if the place is this big, they could feasibly run from here to here, to hide. I mean, you can begin putting the story together using it.
But it's a really interesting approach, and I'll have to remember it when I'm, um, discussing with new authors, kind of like how to go about the writing process, because it is an approach that I would not have thought to recommend. But even if you don't, if you're not an artist, you're still going to be including some kind of art in your scenario. So even looking up stock
Well, and
art.
and it doesn't
um,
even have to be good art when you're in the writing process. You could just sketch something that's stick figures or, a box that has some lines in it for a map that shows generally where things are. At least something to give yourself an idea of what you're talking about.
mm,
And the good thing about that is you can then pass that on to your artist or layout person, whoever's actually putting things together, and that's going to help them a lot when they say, because if you're trying to just explain something to them, it's a lot easier if they have this sketch. Now it's like, oh, okay, I think I see where you're going with this.
mhm.
Even if it's not something they can use, it can definitely impart the idea much better than necessarily the words would.
How early in the writing process do you prefer to get involved? Do you like getting rough drafts? Do you kind of want the near final? What is best for you?
Well, if we're going to talk layout, then I would prefer to have it all written out first, or at least
Mhm.
most of it, because once you know it's it's maybe it's hypocritical, but I like to have the full text done if someone's going to give it to me to lay out. And ideally, it should have gone through at least a good edit and proofreading process first, because it can be a lot more difficult to change to fix things once it's in layout form, especially if you're going to be like the occasional misspelled word, or this should be bold and this should be italicized, that kind of thing. That's easy enough to fix. Um, but when you get into, oh, we need to, take out this paragraph or move this section to here, that can really mess with the layout. And if we reach the point in the layout where, I've started to put in images, it gets like, oh, this is gonna hurt.
Yeah,
This is
yeah,
gonna be a tough one, because now all this stuff I did is now useless. I have to, basically take it all apart and then start reassembling it, and so that it all fits back together. Um, but usually I talk to people about this. I say, if you feel like you need to take out, like, it's going to happen. No one is perfect. They're going to occasionally miss something, or I understand that. But if you're going to take out any significant amount of text, at least if you can try and put something of equal size in its place, that would help.
yeah, yeah.
you know, so I try to work with people to make my job a bit easier. Now, if I'm able to put little, pictures in between text, which is always, I always like to do if I can, that buys me a lot. That buys me a lot of latitude, because now if they take out a couple lines of text, well, I can just make the picture a little bit bigger. No
Mm.
problem. It's an easy fix. I like that. I like easy fixes.
So assuming I have a near final text, what is the best way for me as the author to prep it for you to sort of, take it on and make it the best it can be? And
Yeah, honestly, the formatting is fine. The main thing is that everything is consistent, right? You want to decide what your headers are going to be. Like, because usually you have a few levels of headers, right? You've got the main headers, which are going to be for your chapter titles or whatever. Then you've got major sections within, and you've got subsections, and maybe sometimes you have subsections, so you get this kind of like hierarchy of headers. But no, and that's great. But as long as when in the document you do that throughout, so that
Mhm.
because that's going to tell me all these things happen and take place. Because a lot of times the formatting, if say I'm going from a Word document or an Open Office document or something like that, or a Google Doc for that matter, over to InDesign, some formatting doesn't translate well. So what I do is when I bring it over and I first start laying things out, I'll make in InDesign you can basically make text style. You can make styles, which basically means you can select type, say, header one, and it will automatically format it for you, right?
Mhm.
And so you can that once I know what the headers are and what they mean, what they're for, what they represent in the structure, then I can set up those styles and immediately just be able to, that makes it so much easier. So yeah,
Mm.
I would say consistency is probably the big thing, and especially with Miskatonic Repository, because not everyone does things the same way. Like some people prefer not to bold, skills, even though that's sort of the standard. Um, and even my stuff, I try to go with the standard, but some things that just bother me, I don't like to do, so I do them my own way anyway. But but everyone does things a little bit differently, and I want to make sure they do that. But sometimes you run into ones that where it gets a little tricky, where someone wants to emphasize too much, right? So they end up with bold everything.
Mm.
And then it
Mm.
becomes meaningless because if you start bolding every time you want to call out something, it just becomes noise. The people, you lose the effect that you were going for. Handouts, great, bold those. Skills, yeah, bold those because again, that's what most Call of Cthulhu scenarios do anyway. So
Mhm.
that and that there is something to be said about matching some of what Chaosium does in their official things because if it's what people are used to looking for,
Yeah.
you're
If
gonna
it's what they expect, right? Yeah.
that's right. You're gonna make it easier for them. It's like, oh, my brain knows to look, knows that what this bold means. It knows what this
Hmm.
means, and so that can definitely be useful. But they'll pick it up too with your scenario if you're, if you decide to do things a little bit differently. It might take them an extra second, but they'll pick it up and say, okay, now I know what the rules are for this. Mhm.
If I am going to include a chart or a table or bulleted points, is there a way to do it that's going to be the least amount of work for you on the back end?
Honestly, if you do more as just if you can do it with tabs, that
Hmm.
that at least for me that works better. And listen, by the way, there may be people out there who know really easy ways to take, you know, those charts and convert them over easily, and I'm sure there are people that are way better at this than I am that have learned those tricks, and I just don't know how to do it, and so for me that's an Achilles thing. But but generally speaking, yeah, if someone can do it for me with tabs, that's going to be better because chances are I'm going to have to reorganize it anyway. Because if I'm going to be changing the font, I'm going to be changing the overall look of it, and making it legible and followable. Because again, part of it is if you've got a lot of text in a chart, like let's say you're doing a chart for the results of a bout of madness, right? So you're going to have 10, let's say, 10 options. So you've got your roll, which is 1 through 10. That's easy enough. But then the other ones may be like almost a paragraph of text, right? And so that can take up a lot of space. But if you're doing it in 2 columns, that's a lot of text to put in this little tiny area. So then this big block of text now. And so that can be tricky to sort of squeeze into that little space. Um, and especially if you've got other categories in there besides whatever the role is, if there's a timetable involved, if there's any other little columns that you have to worry about. So it can get tricky. Sometimes you can extend it across both page, the full page in under certain circumstances, and you can get away with it. But yeah, charts have just always been tricky. I think the best thing for me is just if it's something I can easily just copy and paste the whole thing. Because with the chart structure, you really can't do that easily. You get
Hmm.
little bits and pieces of it that are always out of order when you paste them, and it's like, oh, it's terrible.
I'm all the more impressed that you took on the character creation guide then as a project, since that is all tables, right?
It's a lot
Like
of
that is
tables.
tables for days.
It's a lot of tables, yeah.
Uh,
It was definitely a challenge, and it was a big book too. It was not a small
it
book.
was.
Um, but you know, and
well.
and
So, oh,
and I
go
was gonna
ahead,
say
Dan.
you were mistaken about one thing when you said that it was not complete altruism, because there was a bit of selfishness in that it's good advertising. It was good advertising for me, because I knew it was going to do really well, and I thought, if it, people will see this, and might get some stuff thrown my way. Who knows? So
Yeah,
it
well,
was you know
I know that at least with my products, and that includes things like Year of the Goat that I was the editor on. It's very important to me in any advertising to loudly shout out the names of the people who were essential to its creation, and yeah. I generally think folks in the Miskatonic Repository are pretty good about it, but
oh yeah.
to the extent you don't mention your editors, you don't mention your artists, you don't mention your layout design, do so. It is appreciated. None of us do this by ourselves.
No,
Um,
I've always been very impressed by the support you get from the Miskatonic Repository community. It's been amazing. People are awesome and consistently. So I've had really good luck.
but let's talk about then when you
Mhm.
give those authors their first proof of the layout. Um, once you send it, obviously it would be lovely if the author just goes, "Oh, I love this. We're done. I'm publishing now." Right?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
if you're sending it to me, that's not the case, in part
Sure.
because however much proofreading I do, I'm always going to be catching things
Oh yeah,
on another read through, bolding those skills or whatnot. So
yeah,
when authors are providing you feedback to incorporate after the first proof, what is kind of the best way of doing that? I know,
yeah,
you probably know my style by now of like bullets and page number and
yeah.
description, but do you prefer comments in a PDF document? Like, what is for you the easiest?
Yeah. Well, a lot of times the first thing that I will give is a just a couple of pages just to show the layout. Like this,
Mhm.
because most of the time if they don't have any strong idea about how they want it to look, like they might have a general idea, but if they don't have a very strong vision for how they want it to look, I'll usually do a few pages and then give it to them and say, so what do you think about this? And I'll try to give them a good variety of things, like some headers,
Mhm.
some bullet points, some the keeper's notes, things like all the things that are likely to show up, and then they can take a look at it and say, like with the a unique background, because I'm a big fan of not just putting it on white. I like to have some kind of border or background images. If I'm going to put any art, if there's going to be any kind of borders, so I try to give them a good sample of what I'm thinking of for the layout. Um, whether I'm using their material or just putting in garbage text just to fill it in, and then at that point we can say, oh well, can we make these bigger? Most of the time people are just okay with it, but sometimes people are like, well, I really like to emphasize this thing more than this thing,
Mhm.
and we can kind of go back and forth. um but then once we've agreed on it, the only time I'll show them something else is either to say, like I've come up against something that we didn't discuss, like something new or interesting, like, well, like if I have to recreate a chart that's that's
Mhm.
gonna that's gonna look somewhat different than what they had intended, I might show them to say, look, I had to rework this. Is this work for you still? You know, or sometimes it'll be just like I'll put in a piece of art and they'll lay out, and it's like that page looks really good, and I'll share it with them just to get them psyched about it. It's like, look at this. This is pretty cool, right? Like, you know,
Oh, and I know one of them. I have to give a shout out to all the samples you sent to the authors we had on the Year of the
yeah.
Goat project, the scenario anthology, because it was so motivating to the authors. I cannot
Yeah.
overemphasize to you how excited they were to get that.
Yeah, and that's exactly why I did it. I know what it's like to, you're waiting on your baby to be born, and you need to so this is like that little ultrasound you get to that you show off to everyone. you know.
Well,
So, yeah.
well, let's talk about what are, sort of the last point on this topic then, what are things that authors should avoid or watch out for in their communications with their layout artists?
If I'm doing something for a discount, like I do for Miskatonic Repository particularly, which is really what, most of all of this is going to be geared towards. Um, you know, just keep in mind that I'm giving quite a bit towards this. Just give me a little bit back. In other words, not
Hmm.
not in money or anything like that, but just you know, it, don't be too nitpicky about certain things. Like if it's something
Yeah.
that's really important to your scenario, I'll happily change it. We can talk if it's something. Ideally, you want to talk about all this ahead of time if possible. Like if they really have something specific that they need to have in there or needs to be done a certain way, I'd rather have that up front at least, so that as I'm doing it, because there's nothing worse than getting most of the way done and then someone saying it's like, oh no, I need to have all these headers like this, or you know and it changes everything, and that can be frustrating. So yeah, just be as specific as you can up front, and then
Hmm.
once we get past that point, you know try to have a little latitude, because we'll meet in the middle, and you'll have
Yeah.
something that you'll be proud of. I think you said in one of your videos that about creating isn't about going for 100%. It's about going.
80% satisfaction is
Right.
what
You
I
you you
personally
you
aim
aim for
for. Yeah.
100, and
Yeah.
but you're good with 80. Like,
Yeah, yeah. Well, and
and
I think it raises a good point that I think folks who are now getting on the Miskatonic repository may find challenging, because so many things look so damn good. And so you have maybe this idea of a level
so
of
I've raised my own bar too
professionalism.
high, is what you're saying?
Yeah, right, right. Yeah. Well, I mean, in part, right? Like, I think that is the case. I always talk
Yeah.
about how when I started on the repository, there were people literally uploading Word documents,
Yeah.
right? And that was one of the things that helped me, because I thought, like, I can upload a Word document, like that. This is within my realm. But now, if people look, I mean, some of these projects get very close,
Oh
if
yeah. I
not
mean, even
match professional,
yeah.
creations.
I do feel proud about that. It's like I feel like when I raised the bar a bit, and then other people came in and raised it a bit more, and so yeah, it's nice when everyone sort of is. It's in a fun, healthy competition. No one's like angry at each other about it. It's like, oh,
Mhm.
that's so cool what you did. It's always reinforcing and always supportive. It's like, oh, that gave me some ideas for what I can do for mine now because you did this thing. Really our only limitation is obviously, what you're allowed to do with Miskatonic Repository, and also what drive through is capable of doing, particularly when it gets to the print era, the level of things, the POD.
Yeah.
So but I mean that's still pretty darn good. You can still do quite a
Mhm.
bit, with and I've really tried to expand what we've been capable of. I've also learned too, like a lot of the early ones I did were I had to go through a number of steps with, um, especially like print on demand, which was to, you don't get stuff too close to the edge, because with print on demand, the process is not as it can drift a little bit, you
Mm.
know. So if you put like a a page number or important text too close to the edge, you could end up having it like way too close or even cut off depending on what it is.
Mhm.
And so, I mean, they give you rules for that, and I guess the important thing is to follow them because they really mean it.
Yeah, right, right. Well, let's do a timeout here.
Yep.
So we are. I think we've proceeded as a really